The day Hazel Hadley rode into Dusty Creek, New Mexico territory, with nothing but a scorched deed to her father's land and a rifle she barely knew how to fire. She had no idea that the quiet cowboy leaning against the post outside the general store would become the most important promise she ever received. It was the spring of 1878, and the territory was no gentle place for a woman traveling alone. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway had been pushing through the land like an iron serpent, and the men who followed money and rail lines were not the kind who tipped their hats to ladies out of genuine courtesy. Hazel had ridden 3 days from Las Cruces, sleeping against her horse's warm flank in the dark, eating dried strips of venison she had packed before her father's homestead burned. She was 23 years old, tall for a woman, with chestnut hair that had come loose from its pins and amber-green eyes that had gone red at the rims from dust and grief. She pulled her mare to a stop in front of the general store, took in the sight of the small town with its unpainted buildings and its hitching posts lined with horses, and she let out a long, slow breath that she had been holding since she left the smoking remains of everything she had ever known. George Wilcox watched her ride in the way a man watches something that does not quite fit the usual picture. He was 30 years old, lean and sundark, with broad shoulders and a face that had seen its share of weather. He wore a plain brown hat, a blue chambray shirt faded almost to gray, and boots that had been resoled twice. He was not a man who spoke unless there was something worth saying. He had come to Dusty Creek 6 months prior to work horses for a rancher named Abbott, who ran cattle on a modest spread 3 miles east of town. George was good with horses in a way that went beyond skill into something closer to understanding. He could read what a horse was feeling in the set of its ears and the tension through its back, and the animals quieted for him the way they did not quiet for louder men. He watched the woman climb down from her mare and tie the reins to the post. He noticed the way her hands moved, careful and deliberate despite the fatigue in her posture. He noticed the scorched edges of the paper she tucked under her arm. He noticed the rifle in the saddle scabbard and the way she did not reach for it, though she was clearly in some kind of trouble. He said nothing. That was not his way. He simply made room on the post he was leaning against, because sometimes that was enough. Hazel walked past him into the store, and he heard her ask the storekeeper, a round man named Silas Porter, whether there was a land office in Dusty Creek. Silas told her the nearest land office was in Santa Fe, 2 days' hard ride north. Hazel thanked him and asked if there was a telegraph office. Silas said there was a telegraph wire that ran through the station down the street, though the operator was not always reliable. Hazel thanked him again and came back out into the afternoon sun, and she stood on the porch for a moment looking at the street with an expression that George recognized. He had worn it himself once after the war. It was the expression of a person deciding whether to keep going or lie down and let the dust take them. He said, "You got somebody to send that wire to?" She looked at him sideways without turning her head, the way a woman does when she wants to assess a stranger without giving him the satisfaction of full attention. "Maybe," she said. "Because if you don't," he said, "and if that deed needs filing, Porter's brother-in-law is a clerk in Santa Fe who can handle it by proxy. It's worth knowing." She turned to face him then. She looked him over the way she had looked over the town, carefully and without sentiment. "How do you know it's a deed? Papers burned at the edges. Smells like a fire from here. You rode in from the south, which means Las Cruces or thereabouts, which is where the railroad men have been buying up land they don't exactly buy." He said it plainly, without drama, the way he said most things. She studied him for a moment longer than was comfortable. "George Wilcox," he said, and touched the brim of his hat. "Hazel Hadley," she said. She did not extend her hand, but she did not move away either. "And yes, it's a deed. My father's land. 40 acres south of the Mesilla Valley. He died 2 months ago and left it to me, and before I could file it properly, somebody burned my house down and told me the land had been sold to the Rio Grande Land Consortium." "Had it been sold?" George asked. "No," she said, and there was iron in her voice that had not been there a second before. "My father signed nothing. I was there when he died. He told me to hold the land, and I intend to do exactly that." George looked at her for a long moment. The sun was low, and it caught the amber in her eyes and turned them to something between gold and fire. "All right," he said. "Come on, then. I know where the telegraph office is." She hesitated, and he understood the hesitation. He was a stranger with a calm face, and she had no reason to trust him. "I'm not going to take your deed or your horse," he said, "if that's what you're calculating. I work for Abbott's ranch east of town. You can ask Silas Porter about me. He'll tell you I've never stolen anything and I keep my word, which is more than most men out here can say." She looked back through the window at Silas, who happened to be watching them with mild interest, and she gave him a questioning look. Silas nodded slowly in the way of a man who didn't speak freely but wouldn't lie either. Hazel turned back to George. "All right," she said. "Lead the way." The telegraph office was a narrow building wedged between a barber shop and a livery stable. The operator was a young man named Fletcher who smelled of hair oil and was suspicious of everything. But he took Hazel's message and said he would send it before sundown. The message went to a lawyer named Aldous Crane in Las Cruces who had known Hazel's father and had copies of the original land patent. When they came back out into the evening air, the town was shifting into its nighttime character. Lanterns were being lit inside the saloon across the street, and the smell of wood smoke and cooking meat drifted from the direction of the rooming house 2 blocks down. Hazel's stomach made a sound that embarrassed her. She had not eaten since morning. George said, "Mrs. Calloway runs the rooming house. She charges 40 cents a night and the food is decent. She doesn't ask questions, which is the best thing you can say about a rooming house in a town like this." "How much is 40 cents for a woman who just lost her home?" Hazel said, not quite to him, more to the evening air. "I can speak to Mrs. Calloway," George said. "She sometimes trades a room for work. She's been looking for someone to help with the laundry and the mending." Hazel looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" He thought about it genuinely, the way he thought about most things. "Because you rode in here alone with a burned deed and no backup," he said. "And because your father told you to hold the land, and it seems to me like a man's last wish deserves to be honored." He paused. "And because I've seen what the consortium does to people who don't have help, and it doesn't sit right with me." There it was. Not charm, not calculation. Just an honest accounting. Hazel let out a breath. "I can mend my own arrangements," she said, but her voice had softened. "But I appreciate the introduction, Mrs. Calloway was a widow of 50. Compact and direct, who agreed to let Hazel stay for 3 nights in exchange for 2 days of laundry work, which Hazel accepted without complaint. George left her there, said good night with 2 words and a nod, and walked back to the Abbott ranch in the dark because he had horses to water before he slept. Over the next 5 days, Hazel received 2 telegrams back from Aldous Crane. The first confirmed that the original land patent was registered in her father's name with the territory. The second told her something more troubling. The Rio Grande Land Consortium, which was backed by a man named Luther Hale who had made his money in railroad speculation and land fraud, had filed a competing claim through a forged deed of sale dated 3 weeks before her father's death. The forged deed had been submitted to the land office in Santa Fe, and a corrupt clerk named Dwyer had already begun processing it as legitimate. Hazel sat with both telegrams on the front step of the rooming house in the early morning light and read them twice, and then folded them carefully and pressed them against her chest with both hands. She did not cry. She had already done her crying in the 3 days she spent on the road after the fire. What she felt now was something colder and more purposeful. George found her there when he rode in that morning to pick up supplies for the Abbott ranch. He saw the look on her face and stepped down from his horse and sat on the step beside her without being invited. She handed him both telegrams without a word. He read them carefully. "Hale," he said. "You know him." "I know of him. He's been doing this across the territory for 2 years. He picks the small claims, the ones without lawyers or family connections to fight back. He pays the clerks. He files false paperwork. Then he either sells the land to the railroad or holds it for grazing rights. George folded the telegrams and handed them back. He had a man named Cord working for him last fall east of here. A family named Vasquez lost their land the same way. They fought it and Cord burned their second house too with the family inside. Hazel went very still. Did anyone help them? George was quiet for a moment. No, he said. Not enough people, not in time. She looked at the street where morning was arriving slowly, dust rising off the unpacked earth as a wagon went by. I need to get to Santa Fe, she said. I need to speak to someone in the land office who isn't on Hale's payroll. Crane says there's a federal land agent named Whitmore who's been investigating Hale's claims but can't act without a living claimant presenting the original documents in person. That's true, George said. The territory moved to federal oversight of land disputes this year. If you can get to Whitmore with the original patent and your father's death record, you have a legitimate case. I can get there, she said. I've ridden farther. Not through the Jornado del Muerto with Hale's men watching the roads, George said, and he said it without drama, just the plain fact of it, because that was the truth. Hale had men watching for exactly this, a claimant trying to ride north to file. He had done it before. Hazel looked at George with those amber-green eyes and he felt the weight of what she was about to ask before she said it. She was not a woman who asked easily. He could see that in everything about her. Would you come with me? She said. He did not say anything right away. He looked at the street, at the light changing on the boards of the buildings across the way. He thought about Abbott, who was a fair man and would understand. He thought about the Vasquez family and the house that burned with people in it. He thought about the burned edges of her deed and the iron in her voice when she said her father had signed nothing. Yes, he said, I'll come. And that was the promise. It was quiet and it was plain and it carried no ceremony. But Hazel heard the weight of it, and something in her chest that had been pulled tight since the night of the fire eased by the smallest possible degree. He told Abbott that morning that he needed time away, and Abbott, who was not a complicated man, told him to take what he needed and come back when he could. George packed a bedroll, his Winchester rifle, 3 days of food, and enough ammunition to discourage trouble without inviting it. He had a good bay horse named Cannonball who was steady in rough country and did not spook at gunfire, which was the most important quality a horse could have if you were riding into something uncertain. Hazel packed light because she had little to pack. She had the deed, her father's death record which she had carried in the lining of her coat from the beginning, $40 in coin that she had kept sewn into her saddlebag, and her rifle which George checked and cleaned for her that evening without comment, loading it and handing it back and showing her without condescension exactly how to work the lever action because it was a Winchester carbine and slightly different from the rifle she had grown up with. You hold it here, he said, adjusting her grip. Don't lock your elbows. You want to absorb the kick, not fight it. She tried it, dry firing, and he watched her and said, Good, you're not bad at this. I grew up in New Mexico, she said. My father taught me to shoot rattlesnakes. Rattlesnakes and Luther Hale's men aren't so different, George said, and she surprised both of them by laughing, a short, clear laugh that came out of her before she could decide whether to let it. He smiled at that. It was a slow smile, the kind that took a moment to arrive, but when it came it changed his whole face. They rode out of Dusty Creek at 4 in the morning, before the town woke, going west and north in a wide arc that George knew would add half a day to the journey, but would take them through terrain that Hale's men were less likely to watch. He had done enough scouting during the war to understand that the obvious road was also the easiest ambush, and he was not riding this woman into an obvious road. The first day was long and hot and mostly silent, which suited them both. They rode through scrubland and rocky arroyos, through country that was beautiful in its blunt, uncompromising way, the sky enormous and the silence broken only by wind and the sound of horses. Hazel was a competent rider, comfortable in the saddle, and she did not complain about the pace, which was steady and efficient. George noticed that she kept her eyes moving, taking in the landscape the way someone does who has learned to pay attention. At midday they stopped by a shallow wash where water ran cold from somewhere higher up and let the horses drink. Hazel sat on a flat rock and ate the dried jerky and cornbread from her pack, and George sat a few feet away and did the same. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who did not need to fill the air to feel at ease. "Tell me about your father," George said, eventually. She looked at the water. His name was Thomas Hadley. He came to New Mexico in 1863 when the territory was barely settled, and everyone said there was nothing worth having south of Albuquerque. He said they were wrong, and he was right. He built the homestead with his own hands. He grew corn and raised a few cattle and traded skins. He was not a rich man, but he was not a poor one either, and he was honest to the bone. She paused. He was sick for 2 winters before he died. Lung fever. He held on longer than the doctor thought he would because he wanted to see me settled. "Were you close?" "He was the only family I had," she said. "My mother died when I was 8, yellow fever." She said it the way people said hard facts that they had long since stopped flinching from. "He raised me alone, taught me everything I know about the land and a fair number of things about people." George was quiet for a moment. "He sounds like a man who deserved to have his wishes honored," he said. "He was," she said simply. She looked at George then, the way the afternoon light found the angles of his face and settled there, and she thought that he was the kind of man who was difficult to read but not difficult to trust, which was an unusual combination. Most men who were difficult to read were difficult to trust for that same reason. George was difficult to read simply because he did not perform himself. He was exactly what he was, no more and no less, and it was so different from the men she had encountered over the last weeks. The ones who had told her the land was gone, the ones who had told her to let it be, the ones who had looked at her with the particular pity people reserve for those they expect to fail, that she felt the difference like stepping into shade on a hot day. "What about you?" she asked. He considered the question without deflecting, which she appreciated. "I was born in Missouri in 1848, he said. "Grew up on my uncle's farm after my parents died in a wagon accident when I was 11. Fought in the last year of the war, which I don't recommend to anyone. Came west after because Missouri had too much history in it and the territory had none that belonged to me yet." He looked at the far rim of the arroyo. "I'm good with horses and I keep my word and I don't drink past what's sensible. That's most of what there is to say." She smiled. It was a different smile from the laugh earlier, quieter and more deliberate. "That's more than most men can honestly claim," she said. He looked at her when she said that, and something in his chest shifted like a stone settling into new ground. They rode for another 4 hours and made camp in the lee of a low mesa as the sun dropped, and the sky went from orange to deep purple to full dark. George made a small fire, enough for warmth but not enough to be seen from a distance, and they sat on either side of it and ate and listened to the desert making its nighttime sounds, the distant call of an owl, the scrape of something small and quick through the brush. "Are we being followed?" she asked. "Not yet," he said. "But tomorrow, when we get closer to the main road north, we'll need to be careful. Hale has a man named Cord who knows this country well." "The one you mentioned," she said. "Who burned the Vasquez house?" "Yes," she looked at the fire. "What kind of man does that?" "The kind who's decided that other people's lives are worth less than his employer's profits," George said. "They exist in every era and in every place. The territory just gives them more room to operate." Hazel pulled her coat tighter against the night chill. "My father used to say that the territory was honest because it had no illusions about itself," she said. "It didn't pretend to be civilized when it wasn't. He thought that was better than the places that pretend." "There's something to that," George said. He poked the fire with a stick and the sparks rose and scattered. "Are you cold?" "I'm all right," she said. He pulled his extra blanket from his bedroll anyway and held it out across the fire. She looked at it for a moment and then took it. "Thank you," she said. "Get some sleep," he said. I'll take first watch. You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to, he said. She looked at him across the fire with the blanket in her hands and the night behind her, and she thought, not for the first time and with some surprise, that she was very glad he had been leaning against that post outside Sela's Porter's General Store. She did not say so, but he saw something in her face in the firelight that he filed away carefully, the way you file away things you do not want to lose. The second day was harder. By mid-morning they had rejoined a road that ran roughly parallel to the main route north, and twice George pulled them off into the brush, and they waited, still and quiet, while riders went past on the road below, men who wore no particular markings but rode with the purposeful patience of people looking for something specific. The third time they stopped, the riders were close enough that Hazel could hear them talking, and one of them used the name Hale, and she pressed her hand over her horse's nose to keep it quiet and looked at George, who had Cannonball still and steady beside her with one hand on the horse's neck. When the riders had passed, they waited another 10 minutes and then moved on. Hazel let out a slow breath. That was close, she said quietly. Not that close, George said. They didn't have dogs. She stared at him. Does Hale have dogs? Not that I know of, he said. But it's something you want to establish early in a situation like this. She watched him for a moment and then shook her head, and there it was again, that involuntary laugh. He did not smile this time, but his eyes did, which was somehow better. They reached the outskirts of Santa Fe by late afternoon on the second day, riding in through the south side of the old city, where the streets ran between low adobe buildings and the air smelled of pinon smoke and cooking chili. Santa Fe was a city of mixed lives, Spanish and Mexican families who had been here for generations, Pueblo people who had been here longer, Anglo settlers who had arrived in the last 30 years and were still in many ways guests who did not always understand that. The plaza was busy with late afternoon commerce, mule wagons and men on horses and women in wide skirts, carrying baskets, and children running in the dust between feet and hooves. George found them a respectable rooming house on the south side of the plaza, run by a woman named Senora Reyes, who charged reasonable rates and kept her own counsel. Hazel took one room and George took the one beside it, and after they had seen to the horses and washed the road off their faces and hands at the basin in the hallway, they met in the common room downstairs where Senora Reyes had set out a supper of beans and red chili and fresh tortillas. They ate hungrily and without much talking, and when the food was gone Hazel spread Crane's telegrams and the land deed and her father's death record on the table and began laying out the case as she understood it. George listened. He asked 2 questions, both practical, both useful. When she was done, he said, "Whitmore's office is on the east side of the plaza. We should be there when it opens tomorrow morning. Arrive before the other people with appointments. If Hale has connections in Santa Fe, the longer we wait, the more time he has to put obstacles in our path." "Agreed," she said. "What do we do if Whitmore is corrupt too?" George thought about it. "There's a federal judge named Garrison who's been in the territory for 3 years and has a reputation for being impossible to buy," he said. "If Whitmore fails, we go to Garrison directly." "How do you know all this?" she asked. He looked at his coffee cup. "I pay attention to the legal situation in the territory," he said, "because the law is the only thing that stands between honest people and the men who have the money and the guns to take what isn't theirs. If you understand the law, you understand your options." She looked at him across the cluttered table with the remnants of their supper and the documents that represented her entire fight, and she said, "George." He looked up. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it, not in the polite way. I mean it the way people mean it, when they don't have another word big enough." He held her gaze and she held his, and neither of them looked away, and it lasted a second longer than politeness required, a second longer than business required, a second that had its own particular quality, its own particular weight, the kind of second that both people carry forward from the moment it ends. "You'd have found your way here anyway," he said. "You're that kind of woman." "Maybe," she said, "but I wouldn't have felt safe while I did it." He said nothing to that. But he nodded slowly, and that was answer enough. The next morning was a Tuesday in late April, and the air was clear and cool with the high altitude of Santa Fe. They were at Whitmore's office at 7:30, a full half hour before the posted opening, and they sat on the bench outside the door and waited. Nolan Whitmore turned out to be a broad, florid man in his 50s with a thick mustache and the wary eyes of someone who had spent too long in a job that attracted corrupt people. He was not corrupt. He was, in fact, the specific kind of incorruptible man who had been made so by years of watching corruption up close. He looked at Hazel's documents for a long time without speaking, turning each page carefully, holding the original land patent up to the window light. "The Hadley patent," he said, more to himself than to them. "Registered in 1864, Hazel said. "I know when it was registered." He set it down. The competing claim was filed by the Rio Grande Land Consortium under the signature of a Thomas Hadley, dated March the 8th of this year. "My father died February the 22nd, Hazel said. She laid the death record on his desk. "This is certified by Dr. John Merchant of Las Cruces, who attended him in his final illness. The signature on your competing claim is a forgery." Whitmore looked at the death record. He looked at the signed deed. He said nothing for a long time. "The clerk who processed the competing claim was Dwyer," he said. "We know about Dwyer," George said. Whitmore looked at George for the first time since they had sat down. "And who are you?" "A witness," George said, "to the original condition of the property, the fire that destroyed the Hadley homestead and Mrs. Hadley's possession and continuous claim of the land." "Are you a lawyer?" "No," George said. "I'm a cowboy. But I've watched this happen to 3 families in the last 2 years, and I can tell you every name involved, every date, and the specific method Hale's men used to file competing claims. If that's useful, I'm prepared to give a sworn statement." Whitmore looked at him for a long moment. "You understand that Hale has connections," he said. "I understand that," George said. "I also understand that you have been waiting for a living claimant to come forward with original documents, which is what you have sitting in front of you." Whitmore turned back to Hazel. He was quiet. Outside the window, Santa Fe was opening itself up to another day, sounds of horses and voices and commerce. Finally, he said, "I'm going to need 3 days to process this properly. I need to send a courier to Las Cruces to confirm the death record, and I need to pull Dwyer's filings for the last year. If what you've shown me holds up, and frankly it appears to, I will void the consortium's claim and restore the Hadley patent to you." "And Dwyer," Hazel said. "Dwyer will be a matter for the federal marshal," Whitmore said. "That's not something I can promise you a timeline on, but I can promise you that his filings will be reviewed." Hazel sat forward. "And Hale?" "Hale is a more complicated matter," Whitmore said, and she could see the weight of it on him, the complexity of going after a man with money and lawyers and political connections. "But the pattern I've been documenting, of which your case is one more piece, is building toward a federal investigation. What you've brought me today is significant." She nodded. She did not feel relief, not yet. 3 days, she said. 3 days, he said. "Stay in town, don't go back south yet." They walked out of Whitmore's office into the bright morning and stood on the street side by side. George pulled his hat down against the sun. "That went well," he said. "It went as well as I could hope," she said. 3 days is 3 days. 3 days in Santa Fe isn't a hardship," he said. "It's one of the oldest cities in the territory." She looked at him sideways. "Are you suggesting we do something other than worry for 3 days?" "I'm suggesting that worrying for 3 days solid won't make the courier ride faster," he said. And then, so quietly it was almost offhand, "And I'd like to show you the city, if you'd like that." She looked at the plaza, at the ancient palace of the governors with its long portal, at the vendors setting up their blankets and silver and pottery under the shade of the portal columns, at the early morning life of a place that had been old before her country was young. She breathed in the air that smelled of wood smoke and baking bread and something green from the mountains above. "Yes," she said, "I'd like that." 3 days in Santa Fe was, in fact, an unexpected gift. It was not that they forgot why they were there. The weight of it was always present, an awareness under the surface of every hour. But Santa Fe had a way of insisting on itself, on the reality of its old beautiful streets and its mixed and layered world, and George was a quiet and thoughtful guide who knew the city's character without performing it. On the first afternoon, he took her to the Church of San Miguel, the old mission church on the south side of the city that some people said was the oldest church in the country, though that was debated. She stood inside the cool, dark interior and looked up at the ancient walls and felt the age of the place settle around her like something that had nothing to do with her personal trouble, and yet spoke directly to it. People had been holding onto things here for a very long time. People had been losing things and fighting to recover them. The walls were very patient about all of it. George stood beside her in the quiet of the church, and she was aware of how close he was, the warmth of him in the cool air, the solidness. She had been alone for so long, managing the grief and the fear by herself, that the simple fact of another person's steady presence felt remarkable. They ate at a small place on a narrow street behind the plaza, where an old woman made chili rellenos that were better than anything Hazel had ever tasted. She told George this, and he agreed with the gravity of a man who had eaten a great many chili rellenos and could make the comparison with authority. She laughed at his expression, and he watched her laugh and let the warmth of it sit in his chest without examining it too carefully. On the second day, they walked out to the edge of the city, where the Santa Fe River ran shallow and clear between banks of cottonwood trees that were coming into their spring green, leaves turning over in the breeze to show their silver undersides. They sat by the water for a long time. Hazel took off her boots and put her feet in the cold water, which was indecorous and wonderful, and George watched the current move and did not look at her feet because it felt private and he had manners. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Why are you still here?" She looked at the water. "You could have delivered me to Santa Fe and gone back to Abbott's ranch and been done with your good deed. You've gone well beyond what you promised." He thought about that for a while. "I promised to come with you," he said. "I didn't say anything about which part of the journey that meant." "That's a careful answer," she said. "It's an honest one," he said. He looked at the cottonwoods. "I'm still here because I want to be, because I want to know how this comes out, because—" He paused, and the pause was notable because he did not usually pause. "Because I like your company, Hazel, more than I've liked most people's company in a long time." She looked at him then, and he was looking at the water, but the tips of his ears had gone dark from the sun or from something else. "I like your company too," she said. "Very much." The silence after that was different from the silences before. It had a new quality, warmer and slightly uncertain, the silence of two people who have said something true and are now living inside the truth of it. On the third day, two things happened. The first was good. The second was not. The good thing: a courier returned from Las Cruces by noon, and Whitmore had the confirmation he needed. The death record was genuine, the doctor stood behind it, and Dwyer's competing claim was demonstrably fraudulent, filed 16 days after the death of the man who had supposedly signed it. Whitmore called them to his office at 2 in the afternoon, and set before Hazel a restored and freshly recorded copy of the Hadley land patent in her name as lawful heir, with the consortium's claim struck through and voided on the official record. Hazel took the document in both hands and sat with it for a long moment without speaking. George watched her hold it, watched the way her face moved through things too large for her usual composure, the grief and the relief and the vindication woven together. Her eyes went bright and she pressed her lips together and looked down at the page. "It's yours," Whitmore said, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had won something legitimate. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. She looked up at Whitmore. "What about Hale?" "The file on Hale is growing," Whitmore said. "A federal marshal from Denver has been in correspondence with my office. Your case, with the sworn statement Mr. Wilcox has provided, adds materially to what we have. I cannot promise you a timeline, but I can tell you that Luther Hale has made too many enemies in too many places to go on indefinitely." She nodded and stood and shook his hand, which surprised him slightly, but which he returned without hesitation. The second thing that happened on the third day, as George and Hazel came out of Whitmore's office with the restored deed and walked across the plaza back toward the rooming house, a man stepped out from between two buildings and blocked their path. He was large and dark-coated and wore a hat pulled low, and Hazel knew from the way George went still beside her that this was the man he had called Cord. Cord had a face like something that had been hit and had gotten harder from the hitting. He looked at Hazel and then at George, and there was calculation in his eyes, not anger, something colder than anger. "Mr. Hale would like a word with Miss Hadley," he said. "Miss Hadley has nothing to say to Mr. Hale," George said. His voice was exactly the same as it always was, flat and even, but Hazel noticed that he had positioned himself slightly in front of her without making a visible move. She noticed because she had been noticing everything about him for 3 days now. "That's not really the kind of thing you get to decide," Cord said. "She gets to decide it," George said. "And I'm backing her decision." Cord looked at him with the assessment of a man who had done this many times and knew how to read the level of threat in another man's posture. He was looking for fear or aggression, either of which he knew how to use. He found neither. George was simply there, standing in the afternoon sun, neither performing threat nor running from it. "You're a horse handler," Cord said. "You don't want to be in this." "I'm already in it," George said. "The land filing is done," Hazel said from beside George, clear and calm. "It's on the federal record now. Whitmore's office handled it this morning. Anything that happens to me or to my companion changes nothing about that record. It is simply on the record." Cord looked at her. She met his look steadily. She had the deed in her coat. There was a long pause. Then Cord looked back at George with something that was not quite respect but was adjacent to it, the way professional men of violence sometimes regard those who do not flinch. He stepped to the side and let them pass. George walked Hazel across the plaza at the same pace as before, not hurrying, not looking back. When they reached the other side, she said very quietly, "Is he following us?" "No," George said. He had been watching the reflection in the windows of the palace of the governors. "He's gone back between the buildings." She let out a breath. "He may try again later." "He may," George said, "but you were right about the record. It changes his calculation. Hale's whole operation depends on being invisible to federal scrutiny. You've made yourself a named claimant in a federal restoration case. Killing you now would bring exactly the kind of attention Hale needs to avoid." She thought about that. "That's cold comfort," she said. "It's the only comfort that matters right now," he said. And then, after a moment, "Are you all right?" She looked at him and said honestly, "My hands are shaking." "That's the sensible response," he said. He reached out, carefully and without presumption, and took one of her hands in his briefly, and she felt his thumb press once against the back of her hand, steady and certain, before he released it. It was nothing and it was everything, and they walked the rest of the way to the rooming house in silence. They stayed one more night in Santa Fe and left the next morning with the deed safe in the lining of Hazel's coat, which was where she had sewn a new pocket specifically for documents of importance. The ride south was different from the ride north. They took the main road this time because there was no longer a reason to hide. The filing was done. The record was made. They rode in the open air of the New Mexico spring with the Sangre de Cristo Mountains visible to the east and the land stretching out in every direction under a sky so large it made the idea of human trouble seem briefly manageable. George talked more on the ride south than he had on the ride north, which Hazel discovered was a gauge of his comfort. When he was uncertain or watchful, he was spare with words. When he was at ease, he was different, not loquacious but willingly present, more likely to name things as they passed, a formation of red rock, a hawk circling, the way the light was different at different hours. She liked this version of him. She liked the watchful version too, but she liked knowing that this one existed underneath it. She told him about her childhood on the homestead, the particular quality of the desert at different seasons, the way the Mesilla Valley looked in October when everything was harvest gold. She told him about her father's vegetable garden, which was the pride of his life, and about the milk cow he had kept for 12 years and named a leaner after a woman he had known in Missouri before he came west. She told him these things easily, the way she had told very few people, and she noticed that he listened the way he did most things, with his whole attention. "Do you want to stay there?" he asked. "On the land, after all of this?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "It's my father's land." "It's my land, I'm not going anywhere." "It's 40 acres, he said. "That's not small." "It's not," she said. "I can raise cattle on the upper pasture. There's a spring-fed pond near the south boundary that's good for livestock. The soil in the lower fields is better than most people know." She paused. "It's a good piece of land." He was right about that. George was quiet for a moment. "You'll need help," he said. "Running 40 acres alone is hard going for one person." "I know that," she said. Another silence. The horses walked. A hawk crossed the sky ahead of them. "I was thinking," George said, and his voice had changed slightly, the careful quality it had when he was choosing words, "that my arrangement with Abbott is a seasonal one. The summer work is mostly done by the end of June. I don't have a standing contract for the fall." She looked at him. He was looking at the road ahead. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" she asked. He looked at her then. "I'm saying that if you needed help getting the land back into working order, I know cattle and I know land and I'm a reliable hand. That's all I'm saying." She looked at him for a long moment. The sun was at midday height, and it caught the angles of his face and the steadiness in his dark eyes. He was not a man who said things he did not mean. She knew that already as firmly as she knew anything. "George," she said, "Hazel, are you offering to work for me or are you offering something else?" She asked it directly because she was a direct woman and because they had been through enough together that indirectness seemed like an insult to everything that had passed between them. The corner of his mouth moved. "Both," he said, "if you'll have either." The sun was very bright. The land was very large. A meadowlark sang somewhere off to the left, clear and high. "Yes," she said, "to both." He nodded once and looked back at the road, and she could see from the line of his jaw that he was holding something back, some feeling that was larger than the word yes had contained. And she thought, with a warmth that spread from the center of her chest outward to the tips of her fingers, that she had not been wrong about him from the first moment she had taken him in on that porch in Dusty Creek. They reached Dusty Creek 2 days later, late in the afternoon, and Hazel went to the telegraph office and sent a message to Aldous Crane in Las Cruces with the news of the restored patent. Crane responded within 2 hours with congratulations, and a note that he would be filing a certified copy of the restoration in the county records for additional protection. George spoke to Abbott, who was a fair-minded man, and settled his accounts with the ranch in the honest and decent way that characterized all of his dealings. He packed his belongings, which were modest, into his saddlebag and rolled his bedroll one last time at Abbott's bunkhouse. Abbott, who was not a sentimental man, said, "She's a good woman." "Yes," George said. "You're a good man," Abbott said. "I'm trying to be," George said. Abbott nodded, which was as complete a farewell as 2 men of that sort required. They rode south together the next morning, Hazel on her chestnut mare and George on Cannonball, and the day was long and warm, and they talked and were quiet, and the miles fell away behind them. Hazel watched the country change as they moved south into the Mesilla Valley, the colors shifting from the buff and ochre of the high desert to the greener, richer tones of the valley floor where water was closer to the surface, and the river made its slow way through the cottonwood stands. When the homestead came into view, she pulled her horse to a stop. The house was gone, of course. She had known it would be. The fire had taken the main structure completely, and what remained was the stone foundation and the blackened chimney rising from it like a monument. The fencing around the lower field was still standing, iron posts driven into stone, built to last. The old cottonwood tree at the southwest corner of the property was untouched, enormous and indifferent, having been there long before any of this. The small outbuilding where her father had kept his tools was standing, and the spring-fed pond at the south boundary shone in the afternoon light like a piece of sky that had decided to stay on the ground. Hazel looked at all of it for a long time. "It's still here," she said quietly. "The bones of it are still here." "They are," George said. He was beside her, looking at the land with the evaluating eye of a man who was already thinking about what could be done and in what order. "The foundation's solid. You can build on it. The fence line in the lower field is good. The outbuilding just needs a new door and some roofing work." He looked at the cottonwood. "That tree is beautiful." She looked at him. He was looking at the tree with genuine appreciation, and something about that small thing, his quiet pleasure in an old tree on land he had no particular claim to, made her eyes sting in a way that the burned house had not. "My father planted it," she said. "The day I was born." George turned to look at her and saw her expression and did not say anything performative about it. He simply moved Cannonball a step closer so that his boot was nearly touching her stirrup, and he was there, close and steady. "All right," she said after a moment. She straightened in the saddle. "Let's see what's in the outbuilding." What was in the outbuilding turned out to be a significant piece of luck. Her father, who had been a careful and practical man, had stored a secondary set of tools: a second axe, a hand saw, a level, a box of cut nails, 2 hinges, a coil of good rope, and a canvas tarp, wrapped in oilcloth and stacked against the back wall where the fire's heat had not reached. There was also a cast iron skillet and a Dutch oven, nested together, and a tin box containing matches, a small mirror, 2 spools of thread, and a bone-handled knife. Hazel held the bone-handled knife and turned it over in her hands. "This was his," she said. "Keep it close," George said. They set up the tarp as shelter that night in the lee of the outbuilding, which gave them a roof and 3 solid walls, and they ate from what they had brought and made coffee from the spring water, and they sat outside in the warm southern night and looked at the stars over the Mesilla Valley, which were extraordinary, thick and close, the kind of sky you can only see in a place where there is no competing light for miles in any direction. "We need lumber," Hazel said to the stars. "We do," George said. "There's a mill in Las Cruces," she said. "I know it," he said. 2 days' work to frame a basic structure, 3 to close it in, another week to finish it properly. If we start framing next week, you have a roof before the summer heat sets in." "Do you know how to build a house?" she said. "I know how to build a working house," he said. "I won't promise it's fancy." "I don't need fancy," she said. "I grew up in a house my father built with his own hands. It was the most comfortable place I've ever been in." "Then we'll make it comfortable," he said. She looked at the side of his face in the starlight. He was looking up at the sky with the same quiet attention he gave everything, and she thought about what it meant that he was here, that he had come this far from a post outside a general store in Dusty Creek, that he had kept every word he had given her without making a performance of it. It was not what made her feel for him what she was beginning to understand she felt, but it was inseparable from it. "George," she said. He turned to look at her. She leaned forward and kissed him, one brief and deliberate press of her mouth against the corner of his, and then sat back and looked at him steadily, because she was not a woman who did things she wasn't prepared to stand behind. He went very still for a moment, the way he went still when he was taking something in, and then he reached out and took her face in both hands with a gentleness that was remarkable in hands as work-hardened as his, and he kissed her properly, slowly, with the full and uncalculating attention that he gave to everything that mattered to him. When he drew back, he kept his hands on her face a moment longer, looking at her in the starlight with something open in his expression that she had not seen there before, and she put her hands over his and held them. "I've been trying not to say anything," he said. "I know," she said. "I didn't want to make it complicated," he said. "While you had a fight to finish." "The fight is finished," she said. "You helped me finish it." "You finished it," he said. "We finished it," she said firmly, and he smiled at that, the slow arriving smile that changed his whole face, and she thought she could look at that smile for the rest of her life without tiring of it. The next months were the most demanding and the most alive that either of them had ever known. Building a homestead from the foundation up was not romantic in the practical sense. It was hard and hot and humbling. Days of hauling lumber from the mill in Las Cruces. Days of swinging a hammer until your arms stopped feeling connected to you. Days of miscalculation and correction, and the particular frustration of wood that splits wrong or a level that keeps telling you the thing you don't want to hear. But there was also this. Working alongside someone you trusted completely, building something together that neither of you could build alone, is one of the most profound forms of knowing a person. Hazel learned that George was patient with complications and honest about his own mistakes. George learned that Hazel was fearless about difficult work and had an engineer's mind for problems, seeing the solution before most people saw the problem. They argued twice, both times about the most efficient way to frame a door, and both times reached a resolution that was better than either original idea, which seemed to Hazel like a good sign for everything. They raised the frame in July with the help of 2 men from a neighboring property, brothers named Carlos and Miguel Montoya, who were good men and skilled workers, and who arrived the morning Hazel knocked on their door and asked for help. Carlos Montoya was 40 and had been in the valley his whole life, and he looked at the foundation and the stack of lumber and the 2 people who proposed to build a house on it and said, "We'll come Thursday." That was all. He came Thursday with his brother and they worked 2 days, and at the end of it the frame was standing, solid and square, and Hazel made coffee and tortillas, and they all sat in the shade of the old cottonwood and ate in the satisfied quiet of people who have done a full day's work. By late August the house was enclosed, 3 rooms and a covered porch, with a proper fireplace using the original chimney stack, which George had tested and repointed and declared sound. By September the interior was finished well enough to be livable, with a wooden floor in the main room and plaster on the walls, and Hazel moved inside and stood in the middle of the main room in the evening light and thought about her father and about the 40 acres outside and about the man who was on the porch pulling off his boots. She went to the doorway and leaned against the frame. "George." He looked up. "Ask me," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Are you sure?" he said. "We've been at this harder than 2 people should be. I don't want you to feel any pressure because—" "George Wilcox," she said with warmth and impatience both, "I've been watching you keep your word since the day I met you, and I've never been surer of anything in my life. Ask me." He put down the boot he was holding and stood up from the porch step. He was dust-covered and sun-dark, and his shirt was damp from a long day's work, and he was the best thing she had ever seen. He took both her hands. "Hazel Hadley," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, "I will." He pulled her to him and held her, and she put her forehead against his shoulder and closed her eyes, and the evening air came off the valley smelling of cooling earth and the spring-fed pond and the faint sweetness of the cottonwood. And it was, she thought, exactly the right moment for exactly the right answer. They married in October of 1878 in the small church in Las Cruces, a whitewashed adobe building that held the warmth of its old walls in the sharp autumn air. Aldous Crane attended as witness, and Carlos and Miguel Montoya came with their wives, and Senora Reyes, the rooming housekeeper from Santa Fe, who had somehow received word and arrived the evening before on the southbound stage with a shawl she had made herself as a wedding gift. Abbott drove in from Dusty Creek, which touched George more than he showed. Hazel wore a dress she had made herself from blue wool and a piece of ivory lace from Senora Reyes's collection, and she carried a handful of late-blooming desert flowers that she had gathered herself that morning from the south boundary of the land. George wore his cleanest shirt, which was white, and a dark coat that he had ordered from Las Cruces 2 weeks previous. He looked at Hazel coming down the short aisle with an expression that Aldous Crane later described to his wife as the purest thing he had ever seen on a man's face. The vows were the traditional ones, and they said them clearly and seriously. George's voice was steady. Hazel's eyes were bright, but her voice did not waver. When the priest declared them married, and George kissed his wife in the cool, white air of the church, with the dust of October outside the windows and everything that had brought them here still real and present in the room, there was a sound from the small gathered group that was not quite applause and not quite tears, but something of both, which seemed right. They went back to the homestead that evening as the sun was setting over the desert, husband and wife, riding side by side with the valley spread out before them in the last horizontal light, gold and red and deep shadow in the arroyos, the old cottonwood at the corner of their property visible from the road, still enormous, still patient. The first winter was a learning. Hazel had grown up on the land and knew its seasonal character, but knowing it as a child and managing it as a landowner were different. George learned quickly. He was one of those people who, when they decide to understand something, apply themselves to it completely, and by February he knew the Hadley land as well as he had known Abbott's ranch after 6 months. He bought 6 head of cattle from the Montoya brothers in November and a milk cow from a family near the river, and the livestock added work but also income, and by spring they were beginning to think about what came next. What came next, they discovered in March of 1879, was a baby. Hazel told George on a Wednesday morning when the light was coming in at an angle through the east window, and she had been sitting with her coffee for 20 minutes in the particular private way she had when she was working through something important. He was bringing in wood for the fire, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her expression and waited. "We're going to have a baby," she said. He set the wood down very carefully. He came across the room and sat beside her at the table and looked at her with that open expression she had first seen in the starlight on the night she kissed him. He put his hands around her coffee cup, covering her hands. "Are you happy?" he said. "Are you all right?" "I'm happy," she said. "I'm very happy, and I'm a little scared." "That's sensible," he said. "Being happy and scared at the same time is about right for something this large." She laughed, and he pulled her close, and she put her head against his chest and felt the steady beat of his heart and the warmth of his arms around her. And she thought about her father's cottonwood tree, and how it had been planted the day she was born, and how she was sitting now on the land he had wanted her to hold, which she had held, with the man who had helped her hold it, and that the tree would be there when their child was born the way it had been there when she was born. "We should plant something," she said. He looked down at her, puzzled but willing. "What kind of something?" "A tree," she said. "When the baby comes, a tree they can look at all their life and know." He was quiet for a moment, thinking about it in his considered way. "There's a good spot near the east fence," he said. "The soil is deep there. A cottonwood would take well." "Yes," she said, "a cottonwood." The summer of 1879 was hot and busy, and full of the particular preoccupations of people who are building something lasting. George added a small barn to the property with the help of the Montoyas, and they brought in 12 more head of cattle, and a pair of draft horses that George had found at a reasonable price from a man in El Paso who was moving east. The ranch, which is what it was becoming, was modest but real, 40 acres worked with genuine understanding of the land by 2 people who each brought different knowledge to it. The news about Luther Hale came in July, delivered by telegraph from Aldous Crane. The federal investigation that Whitmore had been building had concluded. Hale had been indicted by a federal grand jury in Santa Fe on charges of land fraud, bribery of public officials, and conspiracy, among others. Dwyer, the corrupt clerk, had agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. Cord, the man who had blocked their path in the plaza, had fled the territory and was being sought by a federal marshal. The Rio Grande Land Consortium had been formally dissolved. George read the telegram twice and handed it to Hazel, who was sitting on the porch in the July heat with her feet up and her pregnancy well advanced. She read it and looked at the land in front of her, at the cattle in the lower field and the new barn and the fence lines and the cottonwood in the corner, and she let out a breath that she had been carrying since the night her house burned. "It's done," she said. "Yes," George said. He sat beside her on the porch and put his hand over hers. "It's done." She turned to look at him. "My father would have liked you," she said. "He was a man who respected a kept word more than almost anything." "I hope I've been worth the respect," George said. "George," she said softly, "you have been worth every single thing." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to the back of it, and held it there for a moment, and neither of them said anything, and the valley lay quiet and golden in the July heat around them. Their son was born on a Thursday in October 1879, 1 year after their wedding almost to the day. He arrived in the early morning hours with Dr. Merchant from Las Cruces in attendance, and it was a difficult night, long and frightening, the kind that tests what a man is made of in ways that have nothing to do with strength or skill. George sat outside the bedroom door through all of it and did not move except when the doctor asked for water or cloths, and he was there, exactly there, for every moment. When the crying of a new voice filled the house, George put his face in his hands for one brief moment, not from sadness but from the profound relief of it, and then stood and straightened himself and waited. The doctor opened the door. "Healthy boy," he said. "She's asking for you." Hazel was exhausted in the complete way that only new mothers know, pale and dark under the eyes, with her hair loose and the baby in her arms wrapped in the flannel she had stitched for him through the spring. She looked up at George when he came in, and there was something in her expression that was beyond exhaustion and beyond happiness, something that had no single name but included everything important. George sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby and then at his wife. He reached out and touched the baby's face with one finger very gently, and the baby's eyes moved toward the touch with the blind and searching attention of the very new. "He's got your chin," Hazel said. "He's got your hands," George said. "Look at those hands. He's going to be good at something precise." She laughed weakly. "You can't know that at 3 minutes old." "A man can hope," he said. "They named him Thomas James Wilcox." Thomas for her father and James for George's uncle, who had raised him. The name was chosen deliberately, a bridge between the histories that had made both of them, and it seemed right in the way that the right things always did, obvious in retrospect and worth the thinking beforehand. George planted the cottonwood that afternoon, before the day was out, in the deep soil by the east fence, a young tree he had been keeping in the outbuilding in a bucket of water for 2 weeks, ready. He pressed the earth firmly around its base the way he knew cottonwoods needed, and he stood up and looked at it and thought about the tree at the corner of the property that Hazel's father had planted the day she was born. He thought about the 40 years between that planting and this one, the whole life that had happened in the interval, and about the 40 years ahead for this small tree and the boy named Thomas James who would grow up beside it. He went back inside to his wife and his son. Over the next 2 years, the Wilcox Ranch grew by steady degrees into something that could be called established. They fenced the upper pasture and ran 25 head of cattle. They planted a kitchen garden in the good soil of the lower field, not the full scale of Thomas Hadley's garden but respectable, with corn and squash and beans, and the red chili that was the heart of every kitchen in the valley. They bought a second dairy cow and sold milk and cheese to 2 families on the neighboring road, which was modest income but steady. George's skill with horses became known in the valley, and he began bringing in horses for training, which added meaningfully to what the ranch produced. Carlos Montoya told George one evening in the fall of 1880, over shared whiskey on the Montoya porch, that the Wilcox place had become what the valley called a real ranch. George understood this as the particular compliment it was in a community where real meant earned, not purchased, not inherited, but built with hands and sustained by work. Hazel, who had never stopped being the woman who had ridden into Dusty Creek with a burned deed and iron in her voice, took on the ranch's accounts herself, because she had a head for figures that George readily acknowledged was better than his. She kept the ledger and corresponded with the buyers in El Paso and Las Cruces, and managed the legal paperwork of a working ranch with the same combination of precision and stubbornness that she applied to everything. Whitmore wrote once from Santa Fe to tell her that her case had been cited in 3 subsequent federal land fraud prosecutions, that the precedent she had helped establish was being used to protect other small claimants from the same methods Hale had used. She read the letter at the kitchen table and folded it carefully, and added it to the box where she kept the important documents and the original land patent, the original scorched deed, which she had kept even after the new clean copy was made. George asked her once why she kept the burned one. "Because it's the one that tells the real story," she said. "The clean copy is the legal record, but this one is the true record. Somebody tried to take this. We didn't let them." He looked at the deed in her hands. "We," he said, quietly and privately pleased. She looked up at him and smiled, and it was the smile he had first seen in Silas Porter's general store, the one that came out of her before she decided whether to let it. And after 2 years of marriage, it still had the same effect on him that it had then, the warmth of it arriving in his chest like the first morning light coming over the eastern range. In the spring of 1881, Hazel discovered she was pregnant again. She told George in the same way as the first time, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee and her considering expression, and George sat down beside her and took her hands and asked the same questions. "Are you happy? Are you all right?" And she gave the same answers, happy and a little scared, and they both laughed because it was the same as before and yet entirely new. Little Thomas was 19 months old and already walking with the determined confidence of a child who has decided the world is navigable and intends to navigate all of it. He followed his father around the ranch yard with serious intent, watching everything, picking up stones and examining them, asking questions in the early words he was assembling with gathering speed. He had Hazel's amber-green eyes and George's disposition, quiet and observant, and a stubbornness that seemed to belong purely to himself. The second baby was born in November of 1881, a girl this time, who arrived much faster than her brother and with considerably more noise about the whole business. They named her Clara Rose Wilcox. Clara for no particular tradition, simply because both of them heard it and felt it was right, and Rose because Hazel's father had always said that a flower that could survive the desert was worth cultivating. Clara had dark hair that curled slightly at the temples and an expression from the first days of her life that suggested she found the world interesting and intended to have opinions about it. George held Clara on the first evening after her arrival, sitting in the chair by the window with the valley outside going dark and Thomas already asleep in his small bed and Hazel resting. And he looked at this new person in his arms with a feeling he had no complete words for, but that was something like sustained astonishment, the ongoing, deepening amazement of a man who had not expected. When he left Missouri after the war with nothing but a bedroll and a good horse, and the capacity to keep his word, that he would arrive here. Here being 40 acres in the Mesilla Valley that he had helped a remarkable woman hold on to, a house built from the foundation up by his own hands and hers, a son named for 2 good men who deserved to be remembered, a daughter named for endurance and beauty both, and the woman herself, who was asleep in the next room and who had kissed him first, and who had said yes in a way that left no room for doubt, and who he loved in the specific and complete way that only happens when you have built something real with someone. The years settled and enriched, the way good years do. Thomas grew into a tall, quiet boy who was, as George had observed within minutes of his birth, good at precise things. He had a gift for wood, for the careful and patient work of shaping something functional and beautiful from raw material, and by the time he was 8 he was making small useful objects with his father's tools, boxes and pegs and the frames for window screens, things that were genuinely useful and well made. Clara, 3 years younger, was the opposite of quiet in every regard, but the brightness in her was its own kind of quality. She had opinions about everything and the vocabulary to defend them, and a laugh that could be heard from the far end of the lower field. She loved the cattle with a passionate practical loyalty, and could identify each of the 25 head by sight from 100 yards, which George said was a ranching gift that not everyone could claim. Hazel watched her children grow on the land her father had left her, and kept the accounts of the ranch that she and George had built, and took the occasional afternoon to sit by the spring-fed pond and look at the sky's reflection in the water, just to remember what peace felt like and to be grateful for it. George had become, in those years, the thing he had never set out to be, but had arrived at through the consistent application of his own nature. He was known in the valley as a man of absolute reliability, not famous, not wealthy, not powerful in any political sense, simply known to be exactly what he said he was and to do exactly what he said he would do. When the Montoya brothers needed an extra hand in a difficult season, George was there. When a family named Bright arrived from Texas with 2 small children and no land and too little money, George spoke to Abbott, who still had cattle interests in the territory, and found them work and a place to start. When the valley had a season of drought in 1883 and water rights became a source of tension between 2 families, George stood as a mediator not because he had authority, but because both families trusted him, and the agreement he helped broker held. Carlos Montoya, who was not a demonstrative man, said to his wife one evening that George Wilcox was the kind of man you were glad existed in the world, and his wife, who was perceptive, said yes, but also that the Wilcox woman was why he had become it, which is sometimes how these things work. In the fall of 1884, a letter arrived from Aldous Crane with news that Luther Hale had been convicted in federal court and sentenced to 9 years in the federal penitentiary in Detroit, Michigan, with all of his fraudulently acquired land holdings voided and returned to territorial record for legitimate claim. The clerk Dwyer had been fined and barred from territorial employment. The letter noted that Hazel Wilcox's original complaint, filed 6 years prior, had been the foundation upon which the entire federal case was built. Hazel read the letter at the kitchen table, with Thomas and Clara sitting across from her doing their lessons and George at the fireplace mending a bridle. She read it through twice and then put it down and said simply, "Hale is in prison." George looked up from the bridle. Thomas kept writing because at 9 he was old enough to have a sense of when news was too large for an immediate reaction. Clara said, "Who's Hale?" Hazel looked at George, who looked back at her. He set down the bridle. "A man who tried to take our land before you were born," George said to Clara. "Before this was our land the way it is now." "But you kept it," Clara said, with the matter-of-fact confidence of a child who has never known the land to be anything but theirs. "Yes," George said. "Your mother kept it." "Kept it," Hazel said, the same thing she had always said, and George smiled the slow, arriving smile. That evening after the children were in bed, Hazel took the burned deed out of the box and sat with it at the kitchen table in the lamplight. George came and sat across from her and looked at the charred paper that had started everything. It was fragile now with age, handled carefully over years, the burned edges more crumbled than when she had carried it into Dusty Creek in the spring of 1878. "You should have it framed," he said. "I was thinking the same thing," she said. She looked at it for a long moment. "I want to put it on the wall in the main room where the children can see it." "So they know what it cost," he said. "So they know what it was worth," she said. He reached across the table and she took his hand, the way they had taken each other's hands hundreds of times in the years since that night in the starlight when she had kissed him and he had kissed her back with all of himself. The lamp was warm. The house was quiet with the deep quiet of night on open land. Outside the window the valley lay dark and the old cottonwood, and the young one were both standing in the dark without needing any light, because that was the nature of trees, rooted in something that did not require visibility to be real. "George," she said. He looked at her across the burned deed and the lamplight and the years. "I want to say something that I don't think I say enough," she said. "Hazel," he said. "You don't have to, I know I don't have to," she said, which was what he had said to her once long ago on a porch in Dusty Creek. He heard it and his expression changed, softened, the way it still did when she surprised him. "I want to," she said. That day I rode into Dusty Creek with a burned deed and no plan and more stubbornness than good sense. You leaned off a post and said useful things and came with me, and kept your word through every single piece of what came after. The fear and the uncertainty and the long rides and the man named Cord and 3 days in Santa Fe and building this house from the ground up and 2 children and 6 years of this land. She looked at him steadily. You kept your word through all of it. You kept it through things that would have broken most men's word, because what you promised was open-ended and it cost you, and you kept it anyway. He was looking at her with the open expression that she had first seen in the starlight, the one that had no performance in it. That was simply him, simply George, the man he had always been and continued to be. There was nothing to break, he said quietly. I meant every word I ever gave you from the first day. She stood up and walked around the table, and he stood too, and she put her arms around him, and he held her close in the warm lamplight kitchen of the house they had built together on the land she had fought for with his help on the 40 acres that Thomas Hadley had planted a cottonwood tree over on the day his daughter was born. I know, she said against his shoulder. That's exactly what I'm saying. He pressed his lips to her hair and held her. And outside the October night was full of stars, and the land was quiet, and the 2 cottonwood trees stood in the dark, one old and enormous and patient, one young and still growing, both rooted deep in the same valley soil. The winter of 1884 brought a heavy snowfall that was unusual for the Mesilla Valley, and lay for 2 weeks on the mountains, and sent cold down into the valley that kept the children inside, and gave Hazel and George long evenings by the fire. They played cards and read aloud, and Thomas and Clara quarreled with the specific intensity of siblings who were also genuinely fond of each other, and George mediated with the patient fairness that was his nature, and Hazel made chocolate from the tin of cocoa she kept for special occasions, and they drank it at the kitchen table, all 4 of them, with the wind outside and the fire inside and the lamplight on every face. On one of those snow evenings, Thomas, who was 9 and had been reading everything he could get his hands on since he was 6, asked his mother to tell him the story of how the ranch came to be theirs. He had heard pieces of it over the years, but never the whole thing in order. Clara, who was 6 and did not like to be left out of anything Thomas was involved in, pressed herself against her mother's side and waited. Hazel looked at George, who sat across the fire with his pipe, and he gave her the nod that meant it was her story to tell, though it was also his. She began with riding into Dusty Creek and a cowboy leaning against a post outside the general store and a burned deed. She told it plainly and accurately, without dramatizing for the children's benefit, because the plain truth was dramatic enough. She told them about Whitmore's office and the 3 days in Santa Fe, and the man named Cord who stepped out from between 2 buildings. She told them about riding back south with a restored deed in her coat lining and the burned remains of the house on the standing foundation, and about building the house they were sitting in right now and the first winter and the planting of the East Cottonwood when Thomas was born. Thomas listened with his father's focused attention. Clara listened with her eyes going wide at certain moments and her small fist pressed against her mouth when Hazel described Cord. When it was finished, Thomas said, "Were you scared when that man stepped out?" "Yes," Hazel said. "But you said it anyway," Thomas said, "about the land record." "Yes," she said. "Why?" She looked at him for a moment. "Because being scared doesn't mean you stop," she said. "It means the thing is real enough to be worth being scared of." Thomas thought about that with the serious look he brought to serious things. Then he looked at George. "Were you scared?" "I was concerned," George said. Clara said, "What's the difference?" "Scared means you can't think clearly," George said. "Concerned means you're paying attention." Clara considered this with an expression that suggested she would be consulting it in future. Then she said, "I would have been scared." "That's all right," George said. "You'd have said what needed saying anyway. You're your mother's daughter." Clara looked at Hazel with something complicated and proud in her face, and Hazel looked at George over their daughter's head, and the warmth between them in that moment was the particular warmth of two people who have been building something together for long enough that they can feel each other's love in the ordinary air of an ordinary evening. The story of the Wilcox Ranch became, over the years, one of the stories of the Mesilla Valley. Not famous in any large way, but known in the way that good local stories are known, passed between neighbors and mentioned when questions of land rights or the importance of federal oversight came up, cited by Aldous Crane in his later years as the case that had taught him what a living claimant with original documents could accomplish when they refused to accept that the fight was over. Hazel framed the burned deed and hung it on the main room wall where Thomas asked about it at 7, and Clara asked about it at 4, and both children grew up knowing that the charred paper in the frame was not a relic of defeat but of refusal. Her father's last wish had been honored. The land was held. The house was built. The cottonwoods were growing. George went on being exactly who he was. He was not a man who changed dramatically over time. He deepened the way good things deepen, growing more fully into his own nature rather than becoming something different. He was a better rancher at 40 than at 30, and he was a better husband at 40 than he had been in the first year, not because he had been inadequate, but because time had given him more opportunities to demonstrate the qualities he had always had. He was still the man who said what he meant and meant what he said, whose word was a dependable thing, who noticed what needed noticing and acted on it without waiting to be asked. Hazel watched him one morning in the spring of 1887 from the kitchen window, standing in the ranch yard talking to Thomas, who was 12 now and nearly to his father's shoulder, showing the boy something about the way you check a fence post for rot before the post fails rather than after. Thomas was leaning in with his father's exact expression of focused attention, and George had his hand on the post demonstrating while he talked, and the easy love between them, the father and the son who had his mother's eyes and his own particular gifts, was so clear and so present in the morning air that Hazel put down the pan she was holding and stood for a moment simply looking at it. She went to the door and leaned in the frame, and the morning light was coming across the valley from the east, and the young cottonwood near the east fence was a proper tree now, 9 years old and 8 feet tall, and coming into its spring green, the leaves turning over in the light breeze to show their silver sides, the same as the great cottonwood in the corner had always done, the one her father had planted the year she was born. George looked up from the fence post and saw her in the doorway, and he raised one hand in greeting, the simple gesture of a man greeting the person he loves most in the ordinary morning of their shared life, and she raised hers back. She thought about everything that had come from that first ride into Dusty Creek with the burned deed and the iron in her voice, every piece of what had followed, the fear and the fight and the long rides and the kept words, and the house built from the foundation up and the children, and the years of work, and the particular quality of this morning light on this valley, on this land that was hers, that was theirs, that had been worth every single thing it had cost. She thought about her father, who had said to hold the land, and how she had held it in ways he could not have foreseen, with help he could not have anticipated, arriving at a life that was richer and more grounded than anything she had planned when she planned at all. She thought about a cowboy leaning against a post outside a general store in Dusty Creek, New Mexico territory, in the spring of 1878, who had asked if she had somebody to send that wire to, and who had then, without fanfare or ceremony, made her a promise with a single quiet word, and kept it through everything, through fear and uncertainty and physical danger, and the long, difficult work of building something real, through the days that tested whether a person meant what they said, through the years that revealed whether a word was a word or simply a sound. He had kept it. He had kept it all. She stepped out onto the porch into the morning air and called to him, and he turned and came toward her across the ranch yard with the same easy walk she had known now for 9 years, unhurried and direct. And behind him, Thomas was already returning his attention to the fence post with the methodical focus that was so completely his own, and somewhere in the house she could hear Clara beginning to wake up. That particular sound of a small person who has decided the day, has started whether the rest of the world is ready or not. George came up the porch steps and stopped in front of her close, his hat pushed back on his head, and the morning light finding the gray that had appeared at his temples in the last couple of years, and the lines around his eyes that were from sun and also from the years of the particular expression he wore when he was quietly amused, which was often when she was nearby. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He looked at her in the way he had always looked at her, full attention, unhurried, the way he gave everything that mattered his full and unhurried attention. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She looked at him, at the face she had been reading for 9 years and still found depths in, at the man who had been exactly who he was every single day and had made her want to be fully who she was in return, at the kept word that had turned into a kept life. "I was thinking that you're the best thing that ever leaned against a post in Dusty Creek," she said. He laughed at that. A real laugh, the kind she had not often heard from him when they first met and now heard often, because that was what happened when you gave a reserved man years of reasons to be at ease. It was a good laugh, warm and genuine, and full of this particular morning and this particular woman and this particular life on this particular piece of land that meant everything to both of them. He put his arm around her and she leaned against his side, and they stood together on the porch of the house they had built and looked out at the valley spreading wide and bright under the spring sky. The land was theirs. The word had been kept. And the life it had made was, in every way that mattered, exactly enough.